I think that we're good to get started. So welcome once again, everyone, to this workshop. This is the first in 4 workshops on establishing an independent system operator. My name is Mike Campton. I'm from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in the US, and I am hosting this workshop on behalf of the Global Power System Transformation Consortium. And we've been working with the fine folks at ZESCO, SAPP, and RERA to host this workshop. The Global Power System Transformation Consortium, or short GPST, is a network of power system operators globally that is working to accelerate the energy transition and is working to increase research in power system operations topics, as well as provide knowledge sharing and technical assistance to other power system operators around the world. So myself and one of our speakers, Christina, we're both from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, or NREL, and NREL is currently the secretariat for the GPST, and that is why you will see NREL as well as GPST during this workshop. Before I get into the agenda and get us started, just a few housekeeping items. There are quite a few of us on this call, and thank you everyone for being on mute already. But I will ask if you're not speaking, please keep yourself on mute as to not to distract others. We're using Zoom today, so down at the bottom you can see both a Q&A button as well as a chat button. Please feel free to leave all of your questions that you might have during the presentations over the next couple of hours in the Q&A box, whereas please use the chat to introduce yourselves. We have a lot of folks here from many different countries, from many different organizations. So please introduce yourselves, give us your name, your country, where you're from, and what is your organization, so that we know who we're speaking with today. And then finally, the agenda for today, before we kick off, we have Eliza Ciccone, Executive Director for RERA, who will start by giving us some opening remarks and provide some context setting as to where the region is in the process of trying to set up an independent system operator. And then we'll move on after that to Christina Simeoni, who is at NREL, and will provide the presentation on today's topic, institutional design and governance. And I will ask during Christina's presentation, if you have questions, please put that in the Q&A box, so that after Christina is done presenting, we will move into the Q&A and discussion section of the workshop. And that's when we will read out your questions from the Q&A box. And perhaps if we need more information, we can ask folks to come off mute and ask your question via video and microphone. And then finally, after the Q&A and discussion, we'll end the workshop. Before leaving the Zoom app completely, you'll be prompted with a survey, and I can talk about that a little bit later on. So that is the agenda for the next hour and 50 minutes. So let's get started. And Elijah Ciccone, are you there?
Yes, I'm available.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah, over to you, Elijah.
Thank you very much, Mike. Let me also join you in welcoming all the participants to this first in the series of workshops on setting up an independent system operator. And I can only look forward to our insightful discussions during the course of this workshop. I think in terms of perhaps finishing off my remarks and setting the scene or the context, let me just share a few slides that I'll talk to before I can conclude. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, and it's in the right view.
Thank you. So Elijah Sichone is my name. I'm the executive director of RERA. I don't want to speak much about myself. I think in the interest of time, I only have 20 minutes. But suffice to say that I've been long in this sector. I think this is now my 33rd year. In other words, 33 years in this sector, and I've played various roles. The latest of which is being executive director at RERA for the last 18 years or so. So in the next couple of minutes, I intend to take you through those 5 agenda items. I just want to introduce the organization very briefly so that I think you know what RERA stands for and what RERA is all about. Then I'll speak to certain sector features that are in common across the region. I think these will be a way of highlighting the challenges that are there for us to appreciate and perhaps contextualize the response that we have devised in addressing those challenges. Then, of course, I will highlight the strategic intents and pillars, what guides us in terms of addressing some of these bottlenecks from a regulatory perspective, and also just highlight and share with you some of the regulatory initiatives that we have done, responding to some of the challenges, and then I'll make some concluding remarks. So I just want to say upfront that we're a Sadiq institution, for energy through the Sadiq Secretariat, and in particular, the Directorate of Infrastructure. I have seen colleagues from the Department of Infrastructure joining us, and I would like also to thank them and welcome them. So I think that's just in a nutshell what this slide is trying to show. I will not talk so much about it, but one of the things that was projected at a time when this structure was approved in 2012, particularly when the SADC heads of state were approving the Regional Infrastructure Development Master Plan, was RERA shall be transformed from being an association to an authority, which process is actually ongoing. I think I will not say much about it, but this is something that you can also look up on the website and indeed see the studies that have been done to be able to facilitate, and the process is ongoing. So we are an organization that is basically 20 years old, the oldest on the African continent, and we are based in Windhoek, Namibia, diplomatically accredited. There's only one SADC member state that is left, being the island of Comoros. We've developed a blueprint for the island of Comoros to establish a regulator, and the engagements with the support of the SADC Secretariat continue. We hope we can have 100% in the north.
Elijah, sorry to interrupt, but it seems like you've gone on mute. and we don't see your
Oh,
presentation anymore.
sorry, I'm loading it. Can you see it now?
Yes,
Okay.
great.
Yeah, thank you. So we only remain with one SADC member state to form the regulator, which is the island of Comoros, and we're working very hard to be able to assist Comoros set up the regulator. So I think, what are some of the challenges that we do face in the region? And I must say upfront that quite a number of our member states are making progress in terms of trying to attract investment in the energy sector and the electricity sector in particular. But our aspirations, basically, what we have done so far does not necessarily match our aspirations. In other words, we are lagging behind, and it's not unusual for all of us to see some precarious electricity supply situations in most of, or some of our member states in the region. So what are these challenges that seem to be quite common among the SADC member states? I'll just talk to a few of them. And basically what we are seeing is increasing electricity consumption as countries develop, as populations increase, the electricity consumption is increasing. We are also seeing a lot of unsaved energy. In other words, a large and growing demand unmet. And even when you look at some of the projects by some of the member states, if they were to develop those projects, those member states as a market for those projects may be too small outside of South Africa, which is a big SADC member state. We are also seeing transmission system constraints. I think the SAPP is trying to address this through the Regional Transmission Infrastructure Financing Facility. We're also working with the SAPP. So we do have these constraints on our transmission system. The other point I wanted to state, perhaps it should have been stated maybe more politically correct, but I think suffice to just go ahead and point out that our state-owned utilities, most of them are having non-cost reflective tariffs. In other words, they are selling below the cost, and as such, they don't have a balance sheet to be able to support projects or investment in the sector. We also see a lot of untapped renewable energy in the region. I think for solar, we're one of the best regions. And yet, I think when you look at what has been harnessed is actually far much lower than the potential that we have. Then we also see that I think the political and policy commitment is not to the level that we would have desired to see some changes happening in our member states. I think this is, again, the issue of member states moving back and forth in terms of advancing some of the reforms that were started a decade or two ago. But there is also this uneasy thought of unbundling, and for fear of losing control of the key sector assets. So when you talk of unbundling, I think it's a very contested field, and we see it even where I'm visiting right now in South Africa. There's a hot debate around some of these unbundling initiatives that are being discussed, or initiated by government. But also we have very high offtake risks. I think this is also known. And last but not necessarily the least is a high regulatory risk. The independence of some of these regulators, I think, is questioned, and also they've not been able to basically facilitate, particularly when it comes to pricing issues. But there are a lot of other risks as well that do occur. So this is just by way of some of these challenges that we are experiencing, in the region. So how are we trying and address some of those challenges from RERA's perspective? I think in terms of our focus in the order of priority, we want to see that the market is developed, but a market that is sustainable, integrated, harmonized, and investor friendly. We also want to make sure that our member regulators have the capacity to execute the mandate for which they were established. And so capacity building is very, very key. And of course, energy access is key, but more importantly, to modern, clean, and reliable and affordable, energy services. And of course, we also want to be transformative by way of having dynamic regulation that is responsive to the needs of the time. So that even when we have the likes of hydrogen, whatever colors that one would think of, we should have an enabling regulatory environment to be able to facilitate the development. So those are just the 4 intents or pillars in the order of importance or priority. Now, over the years, the 20 years that I've talked about, we've done quite a lot, and I'll not go through each and every aspect of what is on the slide. Just to say that I'll focus on the market and investment framework for Sadiq Power Project. This initiative was supported by the US government through the Department of State, and we mobilized this support or funding, again, in partnership with the Sadiq Secretariat and the SAPP, at a time. So we have developed this framework, and this is the one that I'm going to talk to now in terms of basically touching on the issues around establishing independent system operator. Now, what this framework has done basically is 2 aspects. We've developed what we call the wholesale market model. You'll see in the next few slides how this talks to the vision of SAPP in terms of seeing a competitive market. But more importantly, is for people to appreciate how this market evolves. We're not asking for a revolution, we are asking for an evolutionary approach, in other words, a step-by-step approach. And there are about 6 or so phases that are clearly spelled out in the framework. So we've got one aspect being the target wholesale market, and the other aspect is the implementation plan. So those 2 are available. You can also read them on the website. And the rest of the initiatives, as you can see, from way back in 2005 up to last year, the last 2 initiatives being the regional grid code, which is also very important when we talk about independent system operators, because this grid code is supposed to be domesticated, at member state level. And also we've done the guidelines in terms of facilitating the development of the sector. The guidelines, we've done its implementation agreement, we've done the wheeling agreement, we've done the model power purchase agreement, we've done the interconnection agreement, the connection agreement. So those are meant to be facilitative, agreements. So now let's talk about the market and investment framework for Sadiq Power Project. The end state is what I am showing, right now on this slide. This is how we vision. So when we talk about having a competitive market at a wholesale level, this is what we are talking to. So this is the end state of what we see, basically, happening. In other words, there is a lot in terms of the elements of unbundling. And one of which you see there is a member TSO. This is transmission system operator, or you can call them independent system operator. At a regional level, they can be called regional transmission operator. So there are various acronyms that one can use, and I'm sure when Christina makes a presentation, she will also talk to some of those issues. So the whole idea is unbundling. That's what we are saying we need to do. And again, we don't want this to be done overnight, as I mentioned earlier on. This has to be done over a period of time in a manner that is managed and in a manner that yields the desired results. So this framework that we've developed, the market and investment framework, also does look at some aspects of institutional and enterprise restructuring. I talked to this earlier on, and as I had shown on the previous slide, we need to see separate transmission companies, in some cases market operators, and in some cases we could have also a market clearing house. It's not unusual to see some of these being combined, depending again on the market and the size of a particular country, or indeed the region, as a whole. But we need significant steps at policy level and commitment to guide this process. So that lack of political and policy will, we need that strong will in place. And this is going to be unavoidable, because if we're going to attract investment and if we're going to develop further, we just have to do this. And this framework that I'm talking about was approved by the ministers in 2016, June. So the decision by the ministers was that member states should implement, in other words, domesticate. The decision was made in 2016. Last year as well, in the DRC, the ministers reiterated the need for member states to implement this particular framework. So from international practice, we see a number of advantages in terms of unbundling, significant in terms of improvements in plant operations, more efficient wholesale trading, more efficient investment decisions, including transmission investment, lower prices over the long term, and also, it stops to some extent the abuse of the market power, because once everything is under one utility, they try to basically exercise, power and indeed in some instances, unfortunately, abuse it at the expense of the other participants. But we also think that this would be an incentive to investment in generation, because everyone would know that they would have, the market is well governed. It's the institutional setup is very clear. So these aspects, the unbundling for the long-term development of our market in the region, it is indispensable. And we foresee, just like what has happened in Europe, where they have these energy packages, we see the unbundling. And again, this has to be systematic. So again, we're not calling upfront to say, go right for the legal unbundling outright. We are saying start with, ring fencing, financial unbundling, and at a very late stage, then you can do the legal, unbundling. So that is a process that should start in terms of preparing as we try to restructure and unbundle the sectors. So in terms of the institutional framework, in this market and investment framework, we've defined, in other words, there are very clear roles, what is expected of government, what is expected of Sadiq, what is expected of the national regulatory authorities, the national transmission system operators, RERA itself, the SAPP, and the market operators. So that is very clear. And in red, I have tried to highlight what is expected in terms of the national transmission system operator. So this framework is very clear. Again, I will not spend time in the, because I think we may take too long to go through each. But as you can see, for the national transmission system operator, the unbundling aspect has to be done. And as I stated, you start gradually until you reach the end. But also there are clear responsibilities that this entity would have to do. And also just the issue of harmonization ultimately, that is also very, very, very key. And so just in terms of this institutional setup, pictorially, this is what we're talking about. And this is basically the end state, because there are two phases. There's a phase where we continue with the 3 control areas that we have at the moment within the SAPP, and with national regulators without a regional regulator, because RERA right now is still an association. And then we go to phase 2, which is the end state, where we have national regulators, but we also have a regional regulator, transformed RERA. And we could have also just one regional market operator, or indeed one control area. Again, this has happened even in the developed world. I hope Christina can share. But MISO in the US is one example where there were thousands of control areas, and these had to come to basically one. So pictorially, this, or diagrammatically, this is what we are trying to show you in terms of what the institutional setup would be under the market and investment framework once implemented. So just to try and conclude this presentation, I just want to emphasize, colleagues, to all of you that as a region, we cannot be in a paradigm paralysis. It's either we innovate or we stagnate. And as I say, change is the only thing that is constant. So if member states, if the regulators, if the utilities don't adapt and enable the energy transition, it will still happen, but not just fast enough. The reason why it will still happen is because the environment is changing. We have climate change issues. We have even renewables, the costs going down. So we have prosumers, and so we need to be aware of the fact that change is there, but it needs to be managed, and hence our need to be proactive. And also, let's be mindful that as the sector evolves as well, there is also the changing use of the networks. And we need to enable greater participation of the growing energy community by creating a level playing field for all players. And this is why unbundling and having the ISO is also very, 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 very key. So we should not just be confined to the past of this single vertically integrated. It could be vertically integrated, but you can still do function unbundling, so that at least it serves the purpose in terms of encouraging investment. So business models, we need to be innovative and indeed embrace the ones that are coming up. So we're now going to have people that will be producing. We can have traders, credit-worthy intermediaries, aggregators, and all what they need basically is at the end of it all to be able to make a return on investment, a reasonable return on investment. And let me, as I conclude, just say, commend ZESCO for being proactive and looking at a bigger picture. And I hope this is basically the message that is being sent or shared by the rest of the SAPP membership. I know the SAPP CC, I think, has been working with us on the market and investment framework. And we think that this step being taken by utilities such as ZESCO, and I should also commend the likes of Namibia in terms of what they are doing, and Zambia as well, what they are starting to do, that all those measures and initiatives are basically talking to what we've espoused in the approved market and investment framework. And let me also end by thanking the National Renewable Energy Laboratory for the partnership and support for organizing this very important workshop. Because what it does basically is to assist us move forward in terms of implementing, the market and investment framework, which was approved in 2016 and reiterated for implementation last year by the ministers. That's all from my side. I think in terms of perhaps giving the opening remarks, and also just trying to set the context in terms of where we are with regard to the thinking on the unbundling of which the independent system operators are a part of. I submit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elijah. That was very important. I think, especially for me, for Christina, I think to understand the situation and your challenges. Just a reminder as we shift over into our next session to every participant, as Christina brings up her slides here, if you had questions during Elijah's presentation, if you have questions during Christina's presentation, please put it into the Q&A box down below. You don't have to remember it all the way until our discussion session later. Just put it in the Q&A box, and then we will have that for everyone to see, and we can discuss later on. Please think of questions. Please provide feedback and comments, and I hope to have a healthy discussion later on. But first, I want to introduce Christina Simeoni from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory to provide her presentation. Christina, over to you. Oh, you're muted.
I'm muted, sorry. That's the sign of the times. Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me, Elijah. Your presentation was wonderful and valuable context and table setting. I'm happy to be included in today's presentation. Again, my name is Christina Simeone. I am a senior transmission planner at the National Renewable Energy Lab. On my background, I have an undergraduate degree in economics, a graduate degree in environmental studies focusing on science and policy, and then a PhD in energy systems. Today's presentation is going to focus on institutional design and governance of U.S. Regional transmission operator organizations and independent system operators. And I hope some of this information will be useful to you as you contemplate some of the decisions that would need to be made to transfer over to this unbundled system operator construct. So moving forward, again, Mike introduced the Global PST Consortium and goals and partners, so I will move past this slide and on to an overview of the presentation, which I'll really be talking about why in the United States we moved to the independent system operator model and what does it do. A little bit about institutional design and oversight, and then governance and stakeholder processes. And if you're not quite sure what governance and stakeholder process really means, we're going to get to all that throughout the presentation. Okay, so starting with why the ISO and what does it do? So in the United States, why there was this transition to independent system operators, or the ISO, it started in response to the energy crisis of the 1970s, where in the United States there were energy shortages, mostly on the petroleum side, but also reached over into the power sector. And Congress passed a law to try to promote independent power producers from a completely vertically integrated utility construct to the promotion of independent power producers as a way to diversify energy supply and achieve other goals. This law kind of implied the right to connect to the vertically integrated utilities grid. But over time, that kind of implication or that the assumption that that would be a straightforward process for the independent power producers was kind of challenged. As a result, in 1996, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which is the energy regulator that covers the whole United States and has jurisdiction over the movement of electricity between states, so interstate electricity transmission, issued this order in response to these vertically integrated public utilities preventing competitors, mainly competitors on the generation side, these independent power producers, from accessing the transmission system. And this was generally referred to as the incumbent, meaning the vertically integrated utility that was in place, exercising transmission dominance. This order required open access to the vertically integrated utilities transmission system at unbundled tariff rates. So we're talking about unbundling the transmission system from the supply, and also unbundling the rates so that the charges for generation and transmission of electricity were separated and would assist in this open access process. So to comply with this order, FERC encouraged, but did not require utilities to, again, voluntarily join independent system operators the goal was to independently operate the transmission system to facilitate open access and interconnection to the system. Again, very important to understand, this is a voluntary construct. This is not something that was required, it was voluntary, and that has some implications, and we'll talk about that in the future. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the examples of transmission dominance that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission cited in its rule in support of requiring open access in this process of unbundling. So I'll read a couple of these examples. I took these directly from the regulatory filings, but I just changed the name of the utilities. So in 1993, vertically integrated utility A filed on behalf of its public utility associated companies an open access tariff that offered only firm point-to-point service with limited flexibility, did not offer network service or flexible point-to-point service or non-firm service. Thus, it was not providing non-affiliated customers or competitor customers with the same flexibility that it was providing to its own affiliated companies. So it was basically discriminating against competitors. The next example, customers allege that vertically integrated utility B refused to interconnect or wheel power through its territory and refused to offer priority service equal to that of its own native load, and then also added charges to transactions to gain a competitive advantage. Lastly, and something that again is, I think maybe still a little relevant, vertically integrated utility C engaged in protracted interconnection negotiations. So for example, 72-month wait times before an independent power producer could interconnect to the system, and requiring excessive amounts of information in the interconnection application process. So those are just some examples, not all, but just wanted to give you a flavor of the issues that FERC was dealing with that prompted it to issue the open access order and pursue this functional and financial unbundling. So in Order 888, which did a variety of things, in addition to laying out the principles of an independent system operator that public utilities could voluntarily join in order to comply with Order 888. So they talked about governance. The way in which the organization runs and how it makes decisions should be structured in a fair and non-discriminatory manner and should be independent from market participants. And this was critically important to make sure that the organization did not conduct itself or establish rules and operating procedures that would benefit a single market participant or a category of market participants, for example, transmission owners, generation providers, et cetera. The ISO and its staff should have no financial interest in market participants. So here, the adoption and enforcement of strict conflict of interest standards for the ISO and its staff. The ISO should provide open access to the transmission system at a single unbundled grid-wide tariff. The ISO should schedule all transmission and ensure non-discriminatory access to all eligible users. So this is functionally what the ISO would do: provide open access at these unbundled rates and ensure non-discriminatory access or interconnection to the system. So that's kind of like the big the big enchilada, so to speak. Then the ISO should have the primary responsibility in ensuring short-term reliability and should be the entity complying with reliability standards. The way that basically works is the ISO has the primary responsibility and issues orders to the different transmission companies, or I should say balancing areas, for example, in this jurisdiction, if there are any actions that need to be taken that it doesn't have control over, for example. The ISO should have control over the operation of the interconnected transmission facilities within its region and should operate the transmission system. Again, another key functional activity of the ISO. And it should be able to identify transmission constraints and take action to relieve those constraints within the rules established by the governing body. And that may include some control over generation facilities, for example, again, to manage congestion, but subject to the rules of that governing body. At the time, FERC also postulated that the ISO would, because of its transmission operation function, because of its reliability obligation, that eventually it would also probably grow to offer ancillary services. So that's another thing to keep in mind, that as part of the kind of the steps, for example, that Elijah laid out, is ancillary services something you're starting out with or something to grow into? Moving on, the ISO should have incentives for efficient management and administration. So management and administration of the organization, and also in competitive procurement of services, for example. And that competitive procurement should be publicly available. So this is about transparency and efficiency, cost efficiency. The pricing policies should promote efficient use of generation, transmission, and consumption investments. The ISO should be able to conduct studies to identify any operational problems or transmission expansion needs, or maybe market expansion needs, for example, into ancillary services. The ISO should make transmission system information publicly available. I'm talking about the free flow of information on a timely basis. There's an asterisk here because contemporary with Order 888, FERC also issued an order to establish an open access information system for sharing of transmission system information. And that rule established this information system and also the requirements for sharing information and data disclosure, and all of the kind of the procedures associated with data sharing, which is a critical component of opening the system up to independent power producers and traders, and making the system more transparent. The ISO should develop mechanisms to coordinate power scheduling with neighboring control areas. So insofar as you're talking about shortages and wanting to import or export from neighbors, those procedures should be in place. There was a lot of flexibility in this requirement because they did not specify the mechanisms for those the coordinated scheduling, and just that they had to be in place. And also an alternative dispute resolution process, which was really to kind of avoid stakeholders coming to FERC with any kind of grievance. There should be an attempt to, at the ISO level, try to resolve disputes between stakeholders, market participants, et cetera, before going to the regulator. Some related orders of significance. We talked about the order that established the idea of the ISO and that transmission owners could voluntarily join the ISO to comply with the order. But after Order 888, there was significant transition that required another Order 2000 only a few years later in response to the transitions that were happening. So to give you a flavor of some of the activity that happened soon after unbundling, and just to kind of prepare you a little bit for, at least by telling you what happened in the United States. Between Order 888 and which happened in 1996, and Order 2000 in 1999, there was a wave of divestitures. So 50,000 megawatts of generation facilities were sold or under contract to be sold. And there was another 30,000 megawatts for sale. There was also a wave of mergers. 40 applications for proposed mergers of public utilities were presented to the federal regulator in the United States. Also a massive increase in trading volume. So Q1 in 1995, which is before Order 888, there were 8 active power marketers and trading at about 1.8 million megawatt hours of sales. By Q1 in 1999, right before Order 2000 was issued, the market had grown from 8 power marketers to 100 power marketers, and from 1.8 million megawatt hours in sales to 400 million megawatt hours in sales. So a massive increase in trading volume. And also an increase in the number of entities wanting to transact in the market. FERC granted market-based rate authority to more than 800 entities in this time period after Order 888, 500 of which were power marketers. So Order 2000, again, was responding to this rapidly evolving electricity sector that was kicked off by the passage of Order 888. It established certain minimum characteristics and functions of a regional transmission organization. So if you think about the ISO as maybe one state or country that has several transmission owners or several balancing authorities within it, and the ISO as the air traffic controller, so to speak, or transmission operator over all of those balancing areas. The RTO is kind of like a metaphor would be like several states or a region. So now you're talking about several balancing areas, several states or countries, all under the umbrella of one organization. And Order 2000, among many other things, required vertically integrated public utilities to consider joining these RTOs. They just had to consider it. They didn't have to join. They just had to consider it. Again, this was a voluntary construct, and we'll talk about why that is a little later. There was also the requirement that RTOs had to have some kind of market monitoring. This was monitoring the market for kind of anti-competitive behavior. By 2008, FERC had issued another order that, among other things, required ISOs and RTOs to establish market monitoring units that met specific criteria with respect to being independent from the ISO. So these market monitoring units really had to be able to function independent from the staff of the ISO to prevent undue influence, and also presented a detailed scope of work the market monitors had to engage in. So the implication here is that while there were some basic market monitoring requirements involved, were put in place in 1999, a decade later, it was clear that these organizations needed to have more independence and have greater direction as to the types of activities they had to engage in. So this is a map of what the RTO ISOs in the United States look like today. You can see California in the West is kind of out there all alone. In the Northeast up here, several, the whole area is pretty much covered by RTO ISOs. And then in the Midwest, there's some good coverage as well. All of these organizations except ERCOT in Texas are all RTO ISOs that were created under the federal authority of that Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. ERCOT was actually a state sanctioned ISO. So when we go through the discussions in the rest of the presentation, we're really leaving ERCOT out because it's a very different construct. But you'll notice, again, these large swaths of gray areas, mostly in the western part of the United States, that have no coverage by RTOs or ISOs. These tend to be, there's a big mountain range kind of running through the West. So there's some kind of topography issues with running transmission over these barriers, but there's also a lot of renewable energy, some of the most progressive renewable energy requirements in the Western United States, especially in California. And what we're seeing is these states starting to experiment with regional markets, but at levels that fall below the RTO or ISO. So things like a Western energy imbalance market, so a real-time power balancing market. There's a Western resource adequacy program that is attempting to allow states to share capacity resources, any excess capacity resources they may have. There's a SPP Markets Plus, which is a day-ahead market proposal. All of these discussions are happening in the West, and what we're understanding is that some of the most contentious issues in developing these region-wide markets and these discussions that may eventually lead up to a Western RTO is the issue of governance and how these organizations make collective decisions when the priorities of the different states and the different areas are very different. And they may not agree on things like renewable energy development or the amount of transmission that should be built, et cetera. So just giving you a bit of a heads up that those governance issues have been quite controversial in the United States. So moving on, we'll talk about some institutional structure. Most of the organizations in the United States are RTOs. There's 4 RTOs and 2 ISOs. Most of these organizations are structured as nonprofits. There's one that is an LLC, a limited liability corporation, but it operates as a profit neutral corporation, which means that its revenues have to equal its expenses over the long term. But in general, most of these organizations are structured as nonprofits. Here's a little bit of information about the budgets and funding. Each organization establishes a revenue requirement that is approved by that federal regulator, FERC, and the revenues are recovered through charges applied to certain wholesale transactions, typically transmission charges. And then those revenues fund the operation of the RTO ISOs. So in general, the RTOs with the largest budgets, meaning here PJM and MISO, cover the largest population of customers, have the greatest amount of line miles of transmission, and the highest kind of annual energy demand. But then the other 4 ISOs, the relationship between population, transmission, and energy and the revenue requirement break down a little bit. For example, ISO New England has the lowest line miles and a higher budget than the other organizations, but this is because it's in the Northeast part of the United States, which is heavily populated, densely populated, predominantly urban areas. So it has a much smaller territory, hence the only 9,000 miles of transmission lines, but a pretty high budget, complicated issues. Where on the other hand, SPP, which has 72,000 line miles of transmission, it has a lower budget, kind of lower on the population scale and relatively kind of mid-range here, I guess, of energy demand, but a lower budget. And this area tends to be rural, less populated. So a lot of line miles, but not so many people. So the budgets can fluctuate. There's some correlation, but the correlation doesn't really hold between budgets and some of these variables. I also looked at some of the key staff skills of these organizations and found that for the most part, there was a lot of overlap between the organizations with respect to the different positions and leadership categories. There was some variation, but the things that were consistent tended to be obviously a CEO. The backgrounds and skill sets of the CEOs were all very different. But the COO, or the Chief Operating Officer, tended to have an electrical engineering background, and that makes sense if their focus is on operations. A CFO or a treasurer with financial or accounting experience, a general counsel to focus on legal matters, government affairs, and it's typically, when it says VP, the structure is often like a vice president of general counsel, a vice president of government affairs, etc. So the government affairs had government, legal, and policy backgrounds, human resources to deal with internal staffing issues, a chief information officer with a computer science background to deal with the multitude of software requirements for the organization, including the different cybersecurity requirements, which in the United States, those have grown significantly. Then a VP for markets, for planning, which is transmission planning, and for operations. For markets, there was tended to be either engineering or economics, which again makes sense. For planning and operations, it was pretty straightforward electrical engineering backgrounds. And then there was typically a person in charge of engagement with different stakeholders and members, and the backgrounds of these individuals was widely varied. But again, fairly consistent that there was someone dealing with these issues. Now, it might have been a VP with that specific title, or it may have been an individual whose title was something more akin to corporate client services or business development. But that individual's main focus was to deal with stakeholders and membership issues. There were some other varied positions around specific topics like internal audits or risk officers, digital strategy, etc. But looking at the top panel here, those were the positions and skill sets that were more consistent across the organization. Oversight of the ISO, and this is the US construct is going to be obviously very different than in your jurisdiction, but there are some important overlaps to consider. So the US Congress here establishes laws. In this case, it's the Federal Power Act. Congress did not specifically authorize RTOs or ISOs, which is one of the reasons that it's a voluntary construct here. Rather, it gave FERC broad authority to promote competition in order to, for example, lower costs for consumers, improve the efficiency of generation production, etc. So FERC used its broad authority under the Federal Power Act to come up with the idea of the RTO ISOs and voluntarily encourage organizations to voluntarily join the RTO ISO. But it didn't have that statutory authority to mandate the organizations joining. And that has created some perceived conflicts. For example, one of the issues in the United States is because the transmission owners can leave the RTO ISO at any time, do they exert undue influence over the RTO ISOs through that, this idea that, oh, well, if you don't do what we want, we're going to leave, and that's going to create problems. I don't know whether that's a real issue or a perceived issue, but in general, there's a lot of discussion about would these organizations be stronger and more independent if the transmission owners were mandated to join. But at this point, FERC has regulatory authority over the RTO ISOs and compliance and enforcement with the rules. So although it can't require a transmission owner to join an RTO ISO, it can exercise its regulatory authority over the RTO ISO to be in compliance with certain rules, etc. In the United States, we also have the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, which develops and enforces electric reliability standards. There is a relationship between FERC and NERC. FERC can request that NERC or require NERC to develop certain reliability standards or engage in certain activities. But ultimately, NERC is the one that develops the reliability standards and enforces them. Another key role of oversight of the ISO is the independent market monitor, which determines if the markets are competitive by looking at things like market concentration, gaming across markets, and of course, market power, and may have the ability to take actions to mitigate or to ask the federal regulator to mitigate. And of course, there are the participating states within the RTO or the ISO, which in the United States have exclusive jurisdiction over retail issues. So while the federal regulator deals with issues that cross boundaries between states, states have exclusive jurisdiction over their own authority. And some of the, just as a heads up, as the power system changes, the line between what is wholesale and what is retail and who has jurisdiction over these issues has become quite blurred, especially when you're talking about aggregating renewable energy, at the customer level, at the prosumer level for bidding into wholesale markets. That's a tricky issue, or residential demand response, bidding into wholesale markets, et cetera. Those are some of the kind of blurring lines that we're seeing as the power system continues to transition. One of the key kind of themes for oversight of the ISO and oversight of kind of electricity regulation in general in the United States is that rates for service are just and reasonable and not unduly discriminatory or preferential. And this is directly from legislation that Congress established in the Federal Power Act. The FERC regulator relies on cost of service-based rates, which I'm sure you're familiar with, to achieve this just and reasonable standard, and also its market-based rate authority. Market-based rate authority relies on the principles of competition to ensure that rates are just and reasonable. But of course, just because you set up competitive markets does not mean that they are actually competitive. And this is why having the market monitors in place is so important. And again, why FERC required RTOs and ISOs to have market monitors in place and make sure that they're independent from the RTO ISOs, and give them a very detailed scope of work to screen and investigate and detect anti-competitive behavior, and then give them the power to mitigate that behavior, or if they can't mitigate it, to file complaints directly with the regulator at FERC. In the United States, there were the RTOs and the market monitors were at one point in time arguing because the RTOs didn't like that the market monitors could go over their head to the regulators. And the regulators thought that it was extremely important that the market monitors have that ability, because of course, if the RTO does something or allows certain behavior to exist that is anti-competitive, and the market monitor detects that behavior, but can't go directly to the regulator, it's possible that the RTO ISO could try to suppress the information from the market monitor to allow that behavior to continue if there are things like regulatory capture and whatnot that potentially could go on. I'm going to give you an example of anti-competitive behavior. This is a very famous example in the United States. This is Enron. So California deregulated, I should say, or unbundled its electricity sector to allow for competition in generation, and eventually it had the California ISO, but it put retail price caps in place to allow vertically integrated utilities to recover the costs of their rate-based investments over a certain period of time. This was called stranded cost recovery. So these rate caps stayed in place for a certain amount of time before the market was open to competition. But at the same time, they did start to develop this competitive market at the wholesale level, and with the kind of ISO, which eventually led to around 2000, these Enron energy traders were engaged in economic withholding, where they were actually taking generation plants offline for maintenance during peak demand periods in an effort to increase prices. And power prices in the wholesale market actually traded for up to 20 times their normal values, which made Enron a lot of money. But because they were taking generation offline, resulted in rolling blackouts. And because the utilities couldn't raise prices to consumers to cover the cost of the higher wholesale prices, actually caused the companies to go bankrupt. So this was this actually California kind of re-regulated its generation sector after that. It still has the ISO, but just regulated the kind of resource adequacy portion of its market. This was a big issue in the United States, and again, highlights the importance of market monitoring. So in the beginning, many of the market monitoring units were located within the RTO ISOs. And today there's only one market monitoring unit in the Southwest Power Pool that's still within the ISO. In general, most of the RTO ISOs have third-party consultants that are external to the RTO ISO doing their market monitoring, or they have some kind of hybrid where you have an external entity and an internal entity. Just another thing to consider. Moving on to governance and stakeholder processes. Governance is basically the way these organizations make decisions. These organizations are kind of quasi-governmental. They are kind of like government agencies. They're kind of like independent organizations. And as such, they have governing documents that any changes to these governing documents, which again, include market rules, rates, operating procedures, etc. Any changes to those documents have to be approved by the regulator. These are like the open access transmission tariff, operating agreements, business manuals. This process of governance, the federal regulator has required a governance process for all the RTO ISOs, but they tend to be very different. There is typically a stakeholder process that engages members and non-member stakeholders in negotiating changes to these governance documents. So for example, if there is a problem identified, like a problem in the market that's identified, or maybe there's a new technology that needs a kind of like an operating profile, or needs to be integrated into the market, and haven't figured out a way to do that. There's typically like a problem statement that is started, and a stakeholder process where negotiations take place to determine, okay, how are we going to solve this problem? Often sitting above the stakeholder process is that governing board that has to be independent from market participants. So the stakeholder process includes market participants and maybe, non-market participant stakeholders. The governing board cannot be market participants, has to be independent from those operating in the market, has some kind of either unilateral or shared authority with the members of the ISO, and basically makes recommendations to FERC about these changes to the governing documents. So, and the way you kind of think about it is here are the stakeholder committees. This is just a simplified graph. There's a bunch of different committees, technical, transmission planning committees. These stakeholder committees come up with the proposed solutions to problems, make a recommendation. There's typically some form of voting. That goes then to the board. The administration of the RTO ISO is typically separate. They may also make a recommendation to the board. The market monitor has the opportunity to present to the board, as well as state agencies who also may participate in the stakeholder process, but have the authority to go directly to the board. The board may have subcommittees, and then to look at issues, and then eventually will likely vote, and then that vote goes to the regulator. If there is agreement on an issue, the regulator gets a strong, a strong signal that this solution is agreed upon and we should implement it, and it kind of limits the regulator's ability from a perception standpoint to go against what the stakeholders have decided. If there is no agreement, it gives a lot more flexibility to the regulator to make the decision. In general, the RTO ISOs, most of them have board members that are approved by either the members of the RTO ISOs, like the market participants or stakeholders, with the exception of California, where the board members are appointed by the governor. So that tends to be a little bit more political, those appointments. And there is voting, stakeholder voting in all of the RTO ISOs except for California. And California's governance process, again, when you saw in the Western United States, one of the reasons that getting out into the West, extending these markets to the West is, a lot of entities don't really want to participate in the governance structure of CAISO, which is the California ISO. And so they're talking about different ways of structuring the governance for a Western RTO, and that turns out to be a very controversial issue. So again, looking at who decides, so can kind of distill all this. Most board members are again approved by other RTO ISO market participants or stakeholders. Existing board members are a combination thereof, with the exception of CAISO. Most voting stakeholders, so the ones who have the rights to vote on certain decisions or certain proposals, are members that sign agreements with the RTO ISO and pay dues. Non-members rarely have voting rights. There may be some exceptions with respect to state agencies or consumer advocates. Again, members pay dues and sign agreements with the RTO ISOs. Most stakeholders typically vote in voting sectors, and there may be sector-weighted voting. Sector-weighted voting is a way to kind of give each sector kind of a vote of one, so to speak, to adjust for sectors that may have just larger numbers of participants. And then FERC typically has final authority. So in closing, there are many key decisions to be made about the function and independence of the ISO. What problems exist that the ISO is meant to solve? And what is the scope? Is it the TSO only, transmission system operator only? Are there going to be markets? Is participation going to be voluntary or mandatory in decisions such as these? For market monitoring, how do you ensure the independence of the market monitor from the ISO? What is its detailed scope of data? And very importantly, how does the market monitor get access to the data of the RTO ISO so it can monitor for certain activity and then mitigate? How do you allow the market monitor to have authority to go right to the board and right to the regulator to really provide that third-party independent function? Staffing and funding, again, the positions and skills, relatively straightforward, but establishing the revenue requirement and recovering the revenue requirement through transaction charges obviously requires some thought. Governance, making sure you're independent from market participants to reduce the idea of capture or the phenomenon of capture. Who are the members? Who are the stakeholders? Who gets to vote? Are there voting sectors and weights? What does your stakeholder process look like? What does your board look like, and who gets to appoint the board? And then oversight, specifically the relationship between oversight of operations, reliability standards, market monitoring, and the relationship between the state and the federal regulator and where those lines may blur. And with that, I think we're right at 45 minutes. So thank you, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Christina. Yeah, I'm going to invite you to stay on screen as we all go to the Q&A and discussion session. As a reminder to everyone, there is the Q&A button down at the bottom of your screen on Zoom. If you click that, you can see the questions that other people have already asked, and you can also insert your question for Christina or for Elijah in that box. And if you'd like to speak up, please raise your hand and we can come on screen once we call on you, and then you can ask your question via video and audio as well. But first, I wanted to give Elijah an opportunity to answer the first question. Elijah, I know that you have written a response to the first question, but I'm wondering if you wanted to elaborate on video and to speak on it.
Thank you very much. And
yeah, so the first question from Ernest is, did I hear right that RERA is planned to undergo transformation from an association? If so, transforming into what?
Yeah, thank you so much. My response is that Ernest is spot on. And this transformation basically is that of RERA moving from being an association to an authority. And this authority, the title right now that is being considered is the Sadiq Regional Energy Regulatory Authority, RERA. So this authority will basically be dealing with cross-border issues. In other words, RERA will observe the Sadiq principle of subsidiarity. That which is best done at a national level is left to be done at a national level. But those things that go beyond the jurisdictions of the countries or the national regulators, like cross-border trading, this is where RERA will get involved. So RERA will assume the function more or less like the way FERC of the US deals with the interstate issues. And again, I think there is a business case on the website in case you just want to have an idea about what else is involved. It's a very short document, and I can also share it with you via email if you like, I think.
Thank you, Elijah. Next, the question for Christina, and I see you just answered, Christina. Musanda Katongo asks, in a case where you have an ISO with a number of transmission regional operators, how is the delegation of authority to the various TSOs by the ISO achieved? What arrangements are provided for rules and regulations?
So, this was basically negotiated between the RTO ISOs and the transmission owners in the initial establishment of these organizations, and really was the basis for the governing documents, the transmission owner operating agreements, which I really think is like kind of what you are, the document that's most related to the question you're asking, but also the transmission tariff. These documents were again negotiated between the RTO ISO and the transmission owner, and then reviewed and approved by the federal regulator, and they became the key governing documents of the RTO ISO. And again, anytime those documents are changed, there has to be some kind of review through the governance process. Does that answer your question? Until I hear back from Musanda, I will go down to Victor, who said, to what extent is information sharing by an ISO and what mode is used? Victor, I'm going to move on to the next question. Would you mind giving me a little bit more information about this? So with respect to data about the operation of the transmission system, that is all done through OASIS, which the federal regulator had a separate order that requires, certain information to be shared by the ISO and different transmission owners, if they're not in an ISO, for example, to make available to entities who may want to transact in the market. And there's detailed rules that I can follow up and send you that are all covered in that order 889 from 1996, which have been reviewed and amended, revised and amended since. There's also some transparency requirements related to data, market data, energy market data, capacity market, auction data, transmission planning processes that the RTO ISOs have. So you generally find a relatively robust level of transparency. I think in the United States at this point, obviously there's always room for improvement. But if you give me a little bit more detail about your question, I can try to provide a better answer. For Ernest, for states that do not have RTO ISOs, how is regulation, if any, of the different players serving the general population achieved? So this is typically done, each state has a state public utility commission or public service commission that regulates the electricity sector within its state. That includes distribution system operators, transmission operators, and generators. Because there's often still interstate transmission of electricity, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission will have jurisdiction establishing the rates, the open access transmission rates for interstate trading, and will also have authority over some of the wholesale transactions that occur from state to state. But in general, each state, whether there's an RTO ISO or not, has that public utility commission in place, the state regulator in place to serve that regulatory role. Let me see, for Philip, how do ISO RTOs coordinate with US state governments, funding agencies to ensure that transmission planning and investment meets all of the stakeholders on the grid? So though transmission planning requirements in the United States are all done by different orders. So transmission planning will occur through the RTO ISOs, will involve the states and other stakeholders. In the United States, you have your local transmission plan, which may have oversight at the state level. This is for the lower voltage transmission. Then you have what is called regional projects. The regional projects are projects that may cross, for example, balancing areas, or may cross different states. Typically, the planning process that is conducted by the RTO ISO looks at the local transmission plan from a do no harm perspective but then conducts different power flow studies, contingency analysis, all the different kind of planning studies, and looks to see if there are regional projects that would benefit the system. These regional projects, if they meet certain cost benefit criteria, may qualify for regional cost allocation, which is something that is very contentious still in the United States, where the entities that benefit from the transmission projects, so for example, the load that sits behind the transmission system, will pay the cost of the project through transaction charges. There's also interregional projects. So that's projects that go from one RTO to the other RTO. And that is it's a little bit of a less formal process and also controversial, but projects that are seen to both RTO ISOs approve of that meet certain cost benefit criteria may qualify for interregional cost allocation, which is again customer supported. The state and federal governments, specifically the federal government, is trying in the United States right now is trying to do more to facilitate regional and interregional projects to better interconnect systems for the benefit of renewable energy integration and reliability. There is some funding available. There's also some efforts to improve the coordination of permits, again, over multi-states and jurisdictions. But that is all something that is kind of happening in real time now. So Philip, I hope that answers your question, and I'd be happy to follow up with you if you have additional questions. Lovemore, the Western states are losing out on efficiencies from centralized markets. California is reluctant to participate due to painful historical experiences and maybe some political considerations. Is there no way of compelling a market in the West? I think there's a lot of progress in the West right now, given the Western Energy Imbalance Market, the Western Resource Adequacy Program, the growth of the SPP Markets Plus, which is again a day ahead and real-time system. And there's a lot of discussions going on about this idea of an RTO of the West. One of the largest stumbling blocks does seem to be governance, since for lack of a better word, political values of these states tend to be very different. Some are very progressive with respect to renewables. Some states have very robust coal and gas resources that they want to exploit for the benefit of their states. So that's a big issue, as well as the transmission system owners. Some transmission system owners see there being a benefit to joining an RTO ISO. Some believe they will lose out on opportunities to increase their rate bases, and also are holdouts in this system. So I think long term there will be a market in the West, but there's a lot of details to work through. Musanda, clarify on the mandatory or voluntary mode of implementation. Does this mean that some players can be connected to the grid and choose not to participate in the market on a voluntary case? How do you account for the services they receive on the network, which are provided by the system operator? So yeah, this is a little tricky. I mean, you basically have areas within RTO ISO that are part of the market and participate in line with the governing rules of the RTO ISO. And then you have other areas which are basically collections of balancing authorities that transact almost exclusively through bilateral agreements. There are what I would characterize as historic or legacy agreements between balancing areas that are not part of the market and the markets themselves for things like emergency sharing of power and really like emergency procedures. That has also those legacy agreements have been kind of in question because some assert that, look, you either join the RTO ISO for the benefits of joining, or you stay out. The inefficiencies created by the bilateral to market procedures, often benefit the bilateral market and relay costs onto the RTO ISO, and that may not be fair. So, yeah, that it is controversial, but I would say it's only really happening around the edges in those like emergency, like reserve sharing, and you basically, again, you decide to join voluntarily, which, for example, we just had in the United States 2 areas decide to join the SPP RTO recently, a cooperative and a municipal system. And that happens from time to time. There are entities who choose to join or to exit from time to time. And then there are, again, these legacy agreements. So I hope that answered your question. Oh, okay. Nzinga, what kind of sanctions are given to participants who violate market rules such as anti-competitive behavior? There are penalties. I honestly don't know the full suite of sanctions that can be provided or imposed upon those who violate market rules, but it's typically penalties and or removing your right to transact in the market. There are also, I should say, credit requirements, which is something that has been bolstered in the United States too in certain areas. So you also have to meet certain financial requirements so that if you get yourself into a position in the markets and you don't have, you lose money and you don't have the ability to pay, that, there are just trying to prevent that type of situation from happening. But in general, if you are violating market rules, you can be penalized and your ability to transact in the market in the future can be taken away. There may be other things too. I think I've gotten through all the questions that were in the Q&A, but happy to answer some more verbally or otherwise.
That was very impressive, Christina. You just went down the list and bam, bam, bam.
Well, I did my best.
No, I think that was really good. Yeah, just like Christina said, if anybody wants to raise their hand or come off mute, also invite folks to turn on the video so we can have more of an interactive discussion, perhaps. Yeah, and maybe we can invite folks like Musanda or Victor if you have any follow-up questions or wanted to elaborate on the questions that you typed in the Q&A box.
Good afternoon, Mike.
Good afternoon. How are you, Victor?
Okay. Yeah, I think Christina's answered my question. Just a clarification. I think she didn't touch on the how. How is this information shared? What more? I know that there are various platforms you can share information. But what specifically? What specific platform is used?
So actually, Oasis is its own platform. I'm not sure if it's cloud-based, but it is accessible via the internet. And I believe there is a different kind of Oasis portal for each RTO ISO. In addition, the RTO ISOs share certain market information through their websites. They tend to have a certain level of kind of data sharing that's available to the public in general. and then a deeper level of data sharing for members that have, you know, usernames and logins and whatnot. So most of it, I guess to answer your question, most of it is, you know, internet software based. The specific platform will change though. I think Musana?
Thank you very much. So I just wanted you maybe to just touch on the issue of maybe ring fencing, where the system operator has not gone the full extent of independence. I think as Engineer Strone mentioned, to say that probably maybe when you are heading towards the independence, you might want to go through these stages where you don't just implement a full out independence. So I just wanted to hear from you probably maybe the best practices and approach. How do you sort of like maybe set up a system operator who would be perceived to be independent from the point of the players? So in terms of ring fencing, and how would that setup be like maybe typically? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'll do my best to answer it. I think there's maybe two issues here. You have the issue of the independence of the RTO ISO, and then the ring fencing of the different companies that occurred under, you know, functional unbundling. So what I would say is, for unbundling of the utilities, the states in the United States that decided to pursue unbundling and competitive markets, there were state level rules that basically required companies either to functionally unbundle, which means go from one vertically integrated utility to a series of like affiliated companies under one holding company, or you had the requirement to divest. And there may be some, you know, between those two ranges, you may have some kind of gradients in between. Functional divestiture is, you know, you are going to separate all of these companies. They're not going to be under one holding company. They have to be completely separate. So it's like actual, like ring fencing within one company, or just splitting everything apart. And those rules were determined at the state level. With respect to the RTO ISO, FERC really relied on, you know, one, these are going to be separate organizations that are not owned by anybody. They were, in the early days, if I recall, there were proposals to have, you know, more for-profit ISOs, but there was concern about, you know, if these were publicly traded companies, or like the conflict of interest that would occur if these were for-profit or publicly traded companies. So the predominant structure that we have now is a not-for-profit company, you know, with no public trading, that again doesn't have that profit motivation or the shareholder motivation. And then, you know, with respect to this idea of ring fencing, I mean, you're fenced off because you're a totally separate organization. It's really this idea of independence that I think has been more problematic. I mean, you may be independent if you have a board that is truly no conflict of interest with any market participants in your jurisdiction. But there are some issues. Well, are they really going to understand the market and understand the issues to be able to serve in that decision-making capacity? I think the broadest concern about independence is really this idea that the transmission system owners are voluntarily participating in this construct and voluntarily have given up their control of their assets to the RTO ISO. That's probably in the United States, one of the bigger concerns, with this idea of, are they really ring fenced from the market participants, so to speak. There has been a lot of discussion in the United States about whether to try to pass legislation through Congress, or try to get FERC to be a little stronger about requiring organizations to join. That is to participate in the RTO ISOs. That is incredibly controversial. I would say, from an ideal standpoint, if you have the ability to require participation in RTO ISOs, it's a much cleaner structure that way. So Masanda, I hope I answered your ring fencing question. I had to kind of break it up a little bit, but I hope that gets to the question you were asking.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Mm-hmm. Elijah.
No, thank you, Christina. I just wanted to add basically that also from the regulator's perspective, in particular the ERB, if we are talking about Zambia, the ERB would have to develop the uniform system of accounts. So that is also a very critical step in terms of unbundling. So you have separate accounts. So for instance, that takes into that looks at generation, transmission and distribution, or however the business is organized. There are examples of those kind of uniform system of accounting. I think NERUC has done some work to assist us as regulators, and also countries like, I think, South Africa, maybe NESA, and also the ECB, Electricity Control Board of Namibia. They've also done something. In the case of Namibia, as you may be aware, even the tariff is functionally unbundled. I think that's a step that also Christina had alluded to in her presentation.
That's a really great point, Elijah. And we do have a uniform system of accounts here that FERC regulates. And it's a really good point. So thank you for bringing that up. Let's see, do we have time? Yes, we have time for a few more. In terms of this is Anthony Mumba's question. In terms of operation and monitoring of the grid, how much visibility do ISOs have of the participant network? My understanding is that they have full visibility. They have control centers where there is full visibility over the networks. That is my understanding. What mechanisms can be put in place to prevent price manipulation, and what incentives or policies can be implemented to attract investment? There are incentives or policies to be implemented to attract investment. If you're talking about transmission investment, FERC has various transmission incentive rates, things like construction work in progress, which is a way to help fund the costs associated with constructing a line before you're actually recovering costs through transactions. There are also some other transmission incentive programs, which I'm not super familiar with, so I don't want to give you the wrong information. I can follow up with you and send you that information. There's obviously also within transmission planning for regional and interregional projects, the idea of socializing the cost of certain transmission builds if there are significant regional benefits. That's a significant incentive as well. So they exist. The mechanisms put in place to prevent price manipulation, I mean, I think the biggest mechanism is the independent market monitor, who is constantly looking at the market, looking at the data. There's a bunch of different metrics that they use to identify market manipulation and then mitigate it. And if they do find it, they can penalize entities for engaging in it. So I think that the main mechanism is the market monitoring and the authority given to the market monitoring units. Are there any other questions? Oh, Elijah again.
No, I just wanted to loop in somebody from the SAPP. I see Elisha is online, so I don't know whether it's still available. So that perhaps he could talk about the issues around price manipulation and maybe the monitoring role in case there's nobody from the surveillance unit from SAPP. Elisha, are you there? Sorry for putting you on the spot. Okay, if he's not available, then maybe I think.
Sorry, Tate, did you just call my name?
Yes, I was saying there is a question around what mechanism can be put in place to prevent price manipulation, and what incentives or policies can be implemented to attract investment. Since you're dealing with the market and you are aware of what happens in the SAPP surveillance unit, I thought maybe you could respond to that.
Thank you so much. Yes, I am particularly in the markets department, but in Southern African Power Pool, we do have a dedicated market surveillance unit. I'm not sure whether the head of the unit, Z, is not in the house. I think he'll be the best person to give us an outline on that one. And nevertheless, we do have standing rules and regulations, as well as tools in this market trading platform, which will then facilitate how we can then manage this process of market manipulation. As you are aware, our market is probably one of the most developed market in the region. We have walked a mile since we established the market in 2000, and at least we've developed tools now to assess the behavior of the traders, the way that they submit the bids, as well as offer some specific training so that we are at least aligned with their specific input. We understand what type of generation that they are using. But obviously, we've got outliers here and there, and this is the process which will then trigger any investigations from the market surveillance team. Thank you.
I think that this is a very appropriate and timely conversation right at the end of our session today, because to add on to this, I do want to let everyone know that our next workshop is actually going to be market design, and that is happening next Tuesday. So in addition to the responses given by Christina and Elijah and Elisha, like I hope folks join us again next Tuesday. Yeah, just wanted to put that reminder out there. As we come to the end of the workshop, any final questions or comments for Christina? If there are no other questions, please feel free to still send us via email if a question comes to you later. You should all have my email. You should all have Christina's email. And if not, you can reach out to our contacts at SAPP, at RERA, at ZESCO, and they can get in touch with, get you in touch with us to follow up with any questions. Great. So thank you so much, Christina. I think this was a fantastic start to our 4-part series on establishing an independent system operator. So really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you everybody for sharing your time with me. I enjoyed it.
And thank you to all the participants. Thank you, Elijah. Thank you, Allison. Thank you, Musanda, for helping us invite all of these participants to join us today. I'll put one more reminder. My colleague Isabel has put in the chat a link to register for our next workshop that will be run by Hans Errol Bredesen, and that will be on market design. So it's going to be at the same time as this workshop. I believe it's 2 to 4 p.m. Central African time, next Tuesday, 26 September. So I will be sending out more information in the coming days so that you don't forget about that session as well. With regard to this session, we'll also be sending out the presentations as well as the recording from this session so that you can have that for reference moving forward. And then lastly, I do want to say that as you leave this Zoom meeting today, there will be a very brief survey. So you can take a minute or two just to fill out the questions that'll help us understand if this workshop provided you with value or not, and help us tweak and improve along the way. All right, with that, thank you all so much. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you again next Tuesday.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.